The newspaper clipping had been passed around the schoolroom table 3 times before Olive Maddox finally snatched it from her friend Ruth's fingers, fully prepared to confirm what everyone else was already laughing about, and what she read made her laugh the loudest of all. Wanted, a capable, sturdy woman of good character and sound mind, to serve as wife and partner on a working cattle ranch in the Colorado Territory. Applicants should be comfortable with hard labor, long silences, and the company of horses. Beauty is unnecessary. Stubbornness welcome. Respond to Paul Atkins, Harlan Creek, Colorado. The schoolroom dissolved into giggling, because it was 1882 and they were all young women in Cincinnati, Ohio, living within walking distance of their mothers, their churches, their millinery shops, and every polite convention that kept a woman's life arranged like a tidy parlor. The very idea of a man advertising for a wife in the newspaper like he might advertise for a new plow was absurd enough. But the specific language of it, the casual dismissal of beauty, the mention of long silences, the cheerful invitation to be stubborn, it was the funniest thing Olive had read in months. She set the clipping down on the table with exaggerated ceremony. "Well," she announced, smoothing the front of her dress with mock dignity, "I am comforted to know that somewhere out in the wilderness, a man of such romantic sensibility awaits his bride. Long silences and horse company. A woman could want for nothing more." More laughter. Ruth wiped her eyes. Clara pressed her hand to her mouth. They were all of a similar age, 22 or 23, all of them navigating the particular pressure that sat on a young woman's shoulders in that era like an invisible stone, the pressure to find a husband, establish a household, and become, as quickly and gracefully as possible, someone's wife. That pressure was the reason Olive found the advertisement funny in the first place. It reduced the entire enterprise to something blunt and frontier practical, stripped away all the pretense of courtship, and left only the transaction underneath. She handed the clipping back to Ruth and did not think about it again. Not seriously. Not for 3 whole days. But Cincinnati in late October had a way of pulling in around a person. The air turned sharp and coal smoke gray. The evenings came early, pressing down on the city like a lid, and Olive found herself sitting in her small room above her father's printing shop, listening to the street below go quiet, and thinking thoughts she did not entirely choose. Her father, George Maddox, was a good man and a patient one. He had employed her in the shop for 4 years, since her mother had passed, letting her set type and manage orders, and occasionally write the sort of plain advertisements that filled the back pages of local papers. She was good at it. She had a natural precision with language, a taste for the exact right word that her father recognized and valued, but the shop was struggling. The larger printing houses were taking the commercial contracts, and what was left barely kept them solvent. Olive knew, in the practical part of her mind, that she was not building a future inside those 4 walls. She was maintaining a present and a fragile one. She was not unhappy exactly, but she was restless in a way that had no easy name. On the 3rd night after reading the advertisement, she found the clipping again in her coat pocket, where Ruth must have tucked it as a joke. She sat at her writing desk with the candle burning low, the street outside completely silent, the city around her reduced to its most essential nighttime sounds, the distant groan of a cart, the bark of a neighbor's dog, the tick of her own small clock. She read the advertisement again. Long silences, the company of horses. Beauty is unnecessary. She picked up her pen. She told herself she was only doing it as an exercise, the way a person might practice a speech they had no intention of giving. She told herself she was mocking it, extending the joke from the schoolroom table, writing the letter as a kind of private comedy that no one would ever see. She wrote for an hour. When she finished, she read it back. It was not a mocking letter. It was the most honest thing she had written in years. She sat with it for a long time, the candle guttering, the room growing colder. Then, before she could reconsider, she folded it into an envelope, addressed it to Paul Atkins, Harlan Creek, Colorado, and put it beside her door to be mailed in the morning. Then she went to bed and stared at the ceiling and thought, That was an extraordinarily foolish thing to do. In the morning she mailed it anyway. Harlan Creek was a town that barely deserved the name. It consisted of a main street with a general store, a livery stable, a small post office that also served as a barbershop on alternate Thursdays, a church that doubled as a schoolhouse, and a saloon that served neither purpose but stood the most firmly of any building on the street. Beyond the town, the land opened up into rolling grassland and rocky draws, broken by cottonwood-lined creek beds and long stretches of blue-gray sage. The mountains stood to the west, permanent and indifferent. Paul Atkins had lived in this territory for 6 years, arriving at 24 with a modest inheritance from his uncle, enough to buy a quarter section and a small herd. He was now 30, which in the territory felt a good deal older than it would have in a city, because the years here were full in a way city years were not. He had built a house with his own hands, 3 rooms tight and solid, with a stone fireplace that drew cleanly in all weather. He had expanded his herd to 140 head. He had learned to read the sky, to doctor a sick animal, to stretch a supply of food or tobacco across a longer period than he had thought possible. He had learned that silence was not the same as loneliness, though it could become loneliness if you let it. He had placed the advertisement because his neighbor, a married man named Driscoll, had been suggesting it for 2 years, and Paul had finally, on a quiet Tuesday in September, decided that Driscoll was probably right. He was not looking for romance in the sentimental sense. He was looking for a partner, someone capable and clear-eyed, someone who would not break under the difficulty of frontier life and then blame him for it. He did not expect the advertisement to produce much. He expected, at best, a handful of letters from women in desperate circumstances, which he intended to read carefully and consider honestly. He received 11 letters in the first 2 weeks. He read all of them. Most were exactly what he had expected, brief, formal, describing useful qualities in a catalog-like fashion. Several were from women who made clear they were hoping to reach California and saw a Colorado marriage as a practical stepping stone, which he found honest at least. 2 were from women who seemed genuinely interested in the work of a ranch, who wrote with specific knowledge about livestock and weather and the kind of labor a working spread demanded. He set those 2 aside. Then, on a cold morning in the second week of November, he opened a letter from Olive Maddox of Cincinnati, Ohio. He read it standing at his kitchen table with his coffee going cold beside him. She began by telling him, with complete candor, that she had initially read his advertisement as a source of amusement, that she and her friends had laughed at it around a table, and that she was writing to him now at midnight some days later, and was honestly not entirely certain what that meant about her state of mind. She then proceeded to describe herself in a manner so devoid of flattery that it was almost startling. She was 23. She was of middling height and unremarkable appearance, though she had been told she had a capable look about her, which she chose to take as a compliment. She had worked in her father's printing shop for 4 years and knew how to set type, manage accounts, and write clear plain prose. She had no experience with livestock, but had grown up with a large garden and an even larger sense of what hard work actually required. She was not afraid of difficult things. She was, by her own admission, stubborn to a degree that had cost her several otherwise promising situations. She liked the outdoors more than was entirely proper for a woman of her station. She had opinions about nearly everything and had never successfully learned to keep them to herself. She wrote, "I do not know what I am doing writing this letter, but I find I am tired of knowing exactly what I am doing at all times, and this seemed like the sort of thing a person might do at midnight when they have run out of more sensible alternatives." Paul set the letter down, picked it up again, read the last paragraph twice. He wrote back the same evening. It took 3 weeks for his reply to reach Cincinnati. Olive had half convinced herself in those 3 weeks that she had imagined posting the letter, or that it had been lost in the mail, or that the man had read it and thrown it directly into his fireplace, which would have been an entirely reasonable response. When the envelope arrived with a Colorado postmark, she stood in the post office for a moment longer than was necessary before taking it home to read in private. Paul Atkins wrote the way he apparently lived. Cleanly, without decoration, but with a precision that surprised her. He said he appreciated her honesty about laughing at the advertisement, because he had written it in a similar spirit of blunt practicality and had expected to be laughed at. He said the qualities she described in herself were exactly the ones he needed. He said the stubborn part did not concern him. He described his ranch in brief, specific terms: the acreage, the herd size, the distance to town, the nearest neighbor. He described the house as solid and the winters as serious. He described himself in the same unadorned manner she had used, 30 years old, a practical man with no serious vices except a weakness for strong coffee and a habit of reading whatever he could get his hands on, which out here was somewhat limited. He ended the letter by asking if she would like to continue the correspondence, making clear that he understood if the full picture of the situation changed her mind, and that he would not hold any change of mind against her. She wrote back before supper. They wrote for 4 months. Olive had not expected to enjoy the letters as much as she did. She had assumed the correspondence would be a practical exchange, logistics and qualities, and the careful building of a practical case for or against a life-altering decision. And there was some of that, certainly. Paul was thorough and honest and asked specific questions about her abilities and expectations. She answered them honestly. He described the ranch's needs and rhythms with the same precision he brought to everything. She asked questions in return about the territory, the weather, the nearest town, the nature of the work in each season. But the letters became something else as well, something she had not anticipated. Paul had a dry humor that appeared in the margins of practical information like a small, unexpected flower. He told her about a calf that had somehow gotten itself stuck inside the barn's water trough and stood there looking personally affronted until Paul had lifted it out. He told her about the particular stubbornness of Colorado weather, which he said changed moods more dramatically and more frequently than any person he had ever known, which he considered both annoying and admirable. He told her about the books he had managed to acquire, a Shakespeare collection, a complete set of Dickens, a geological survey of the territory that he found unexpectedly fascinating, and he asked what she was reading. Olive found herself writing letters that she revised 2 and 3 times, not to sound better, but to sound more precisely like herself. She told him about her father's printing shop, about the particular smell of ink and paper that she associated with every morning of her adult life. She told him that she had read everything in her father's small library twice, and had started reading the works that came through the shop for printing, local histories and agricultural pamphlets, and one extraordinarily detailed catalog of Colorado Territory mineral rights that she had read simply because it was there. She told him that she had a tendency to organize things that did not strictly need organizing, that she once spent an entire Sunday afternoon reorganizing the shop's type drawer in a way that made typesetting 20% more efficient, and that she considered this one of her better achievements. He wrote back, "The type drawer story tells me more about you than anything else you have said, and all of it is good." She read that line 4 times in a row and felt something move in her chest that was entirely inconvenient. In February, Paul wrote that he thought it was time to ask her directly. He said he was aware that the situation was unusual and that the decision was hers entirely to make. He said that based on 4 months of letters, he believed they were genuinely compatible in the ways that mattered for the life he was asking her to share, and that he believed she was the kind of person who could make something real out of the frontier rather than simply surviving it. He said he was prepared to purchase her train ticket if she was willing to come out and meet him properly, and that she was under no obligation to stay if the reality did not match the letters. He said the arrangement would be entered into carefully and honestly, and that he wanted her to understand that he meant what he wrote and expected the same from her. She showed the letter to her father. George Maddox was a quiet man who had spent 40 years watching people make decisions, good ones and bad ones, and had developed a fairly reliable instinct for the difference. He read Paul's letter twice, slowly, then handed it back to his daughter. "He writes like a man who means what he says," George said. "He does," Olive agreed. "Colorado is a long way from Cincinnati," he said. "I know that." George was quiet for a moment. He looked at his daughter with the particular look of a father who sees his child as both the child they were and the adult they have become, seeing both at once with complete and somewhat painful clarity. "Are you going?" he asked. Olive looked at the letter in her hands. She thought about the 4 months of words she and this man had exchanged, the way his voice had become, in the space of those letters, genuinely familiar to her. She thought about the small room above the printing shop, the coal-smoked sky, the evenings that came too early. She thought about long silences and the company of horses, and realized she was no longer laughing. "I think I am," she said. The train journey from Cincinnati to Denver took 4 days. From Denver, a stagecoach ran 3 times a week to the smaller towns along the eastern range, and Olive arrived in the nearest sizable settlement to Harlan Creek on a Thursday morning in April of 1883, stiff-backed and trail-dusted, and considerably more uncertain than she had permitted herself to be during the preceding months. Paul Atkins had written that he would meet her at the stage stop in Millhaven, the nearest town of any real size to his ranch, about 12 miles from Harlan Creek itself. He had described himself briefly. Tall, brown hair, usually wearing a gray hat, would be driving a wagon with 2 horses. She spotted him before he spotted her. He was standing beside the wagon exactly as described, hat in hand, watching the stage stop with an expression of careful attention that she recognized immediately, because it was the same expression she imagined he brought to everything. He was tall, yes, broad-shouldered in the way of men who did physical work consistently, with a face that was weathered but not hard, the kind of face that had spent years in open air and recorded every season of it. He was not what she would have called conventionally handsome, but there was something in his face, in the set of it, that she found immediately trustworthy, and she had learned to value that quality far above conventional handsomeness. He turned and saw her. For a moment they simply looked at each other from 20 feet of dusty Colorado street. He walked toward her and she walked toward him, and they met in the middle, which seemed, she would think later, entirely appropriate. "Maddox," he said. "Mr. Atkins," she replied. He extended his hand and she shook it, and the handshake lasted exactly the right amount of time. "How was the journey?" he asked. 4 days on a train and a morning on a stage," she said. "I have eaten things I cannot identify and slept at angles that will take several days to correct. But the landscape in this territory is extraordinary, and I have been looking out windows the entire way." Something shifted in his expression, a subtle warming. "That's Colorado," he said. "It tends to demand your attention." He helped her up to the wagon with a hand that was brief and practical, and they drove the 12 miles to Harlan Creek through country that opened and opened ahead of them like a sentence building, to something she had not yet heard. The town of Harlan Creek produced 2 definite reactions when Paul Atkins arrived with Olive Maddox in his wagon. The first was immediate and enthusiastic curiosity, because there were few enough new things in a small frontier town that the arrival of a potential wife for the Atkins ranch constituted genuine news. The second, confined mainly to the women who gathered at the general store on Thursday mornings, was a careful, measuring assessment that Olive felt across the back of her neck like a touch. Paul introduced her at the general store, where a man named Holt ran the counter and appeared to function as the town's unofficial information exchange. He was a wide-faced, good-humored man of about 50 who shook Olive's hand and looked at her with an expression of undisguised approval. "So you're the one who answered the advertisement," he said. "One of several, I understand," Olive replied. I am told I had competition from 11 other letters. 11 letters, Holt said, looking at Paul with evident satisfaction. And you picked this one. Good instincts as usual. Paul did not appear to embarrass easily, which Olive noted and appreciated. The women were 3 in number and ranged from warm to cautious. Martha Driscoll, wife of Paul's neighbor, was small and weathered and immediately welcoming, the kind of woman who assessed a new person quickly and thoroughly and then made up her mind without much drama. She looked at Olive with bright brown eyes and nodded once like a decision reached. "You have good hands," Martha said. "Working hands, that's what matters out here." Olive looked at her own hands, which were indeed capable looking from 4 years of typesetting. "I appreciate the practical assessment," she said. Martha smiled. "You'll do," she said, which in its directness was the most satisfying welcome Olive received that day. The ranch was a further 4 miles outside Harlan Creek, down a track that crossed 2 shallow creek beds and climbed a long rise before the house came into view. It was exactly as Paul had described it. 3 rooms, stone fireplace, tight and solid, with a small barn and several outbuildings arranged with practical economy. The land around it was wide and rolling, brown with the end of winter but showing the first green push of spring in the creek bottoms, and the mountains to the west were still snow-capped and enormous against the afternoon sky. Olive stood in the wagon and looked at it all for a moment before climbing down. "It's exactly as you described it," she said. "I try not to describe things I haven't seen," he replied. She understood that this was important information about him, and she filed it carefully. He showed her the house. It was plain and functional, every object in it chosen for use rather than appearance. But there were bookshelves. Real ones built into the wall beside the fireplace, full of exactly the books he had mentioned in his letters plus a few he had not, and this fact moved her in a way that the mountains outside had not quite managed. She ran her finger along the spines. "Dickens," she said, "all of him. Hard to come by out here," he said. "Took 3 years to assemble." She turned and looked at him. He was standing in the doorway of the room, holding his hat, looking at her with an expression she could not entirely read but felt entirely at ease with, which was itself a form of remarkable information. "I think," she said carefully, "that this is going to work." He nodded slowly. "I've thought that since February," he said, "since the letter about the type drawer." They were married at the Harlan Creek Church on the 15th of April, 1883, 3 days after her arrival. The ceremony was conducted by the local minister, a thin, earnest man named Reverend Cole, who had apparently performed a sufficient number of frontier marriages to have learned the value of brevity. Martha Driscoll and her husband stood as witnesses. Holt from the general store came, as did 6 or 7 other people from town and the surrounding homesteads, because in Harlan Creek, a wedding constituted a community event and no one intended to miss it. Olive wore the best dress she had brought with her, a dark blue wool that was practical enough to have made the journey without ruining and fine enough to mark the occasion. Paul wore his cleanest shirt and a jacket that had probably seen use at the previous major occasion in his life, and would likely see use at the next one. He looked, she thought, exactly like himself, which was the most reassuring thing he could have done. When Reverend Cole asked if she took this man for her lawfully wedded husband, Olive looked directly at Paul Atkins and said, "I do," with a certainty that surprised her with its completeness. She saw something move across his face at that, something that was not quite the careful practicality she associated with everything he did, something warmer and less managed. She thought she understood it. She was feeling something similar. The first weeks of the marriage were a careful, genuine negotiation. Olive had come to the frontier with honest expectations and found that the reality was still harder than the expectations in several specific ways she had not anticipated. The physical work was the easiest adjustment because she had not lied about her capacity for it. Rising before first light, making fires, managing the kitchen garden that had been planted in a small flat patch south of the house, learning the particular rhythms of a working cattle ranch. All of this was demanding but comprehensible. She was tired at the end of every day in a way that was deeply physical and fundamentally satisfying. The harder adjustment was the space itself. She had grown up in a city, and the silence of the Colorado evenings, the absolute dark of a night without gas lamps or street noise, the way the land stretched in every direction without end, this took genuine getting used to. She did not break under it. But there were several evenings in that first month when she sat on the step of the porch after supper and felt the silence pressing in and had to hold herself steady until it passed. Paul seemed to understand this without her explaining it. He never intruded on the moments when she needed to find her footing, but he was consistently, quietly present in a way that made the finding easier. He would bring her coffee on the porch step and sit beside her without speaking, and his presence beside her in the dark gradually changed the character of the silence from something vast and isolating to something shared and large and interesting. She found, as the weeks passed, that she was beginning to love the land. The work of the ranch in spring was unceasing. Calving season required constant attention, and Olive threw herself into it with the wholehearted commitment she brought to any task once she had decided to take it seriously. She was startled by her own reaction to her first calving, the raw, effortful life of it, the calf arriving in the world wet and struggling, and then, within an hour, standing unsteadily on legs that seemed made of pure ambition. She stood in the barn with Paul watching it and felt something she did not immediately have words for. "Every time," Paul said quietly, watching the calf. "Every time what?" she asked. "Every time it does the same thing to me," he said. "That stubborn pulling toward being alive." She looked at him in the barn's dim light. This was, she understood, a significant piece of Paul Atkins, a man who felt things with quiet depth and expressed them with brief precision, and who had just told her something true about himself without making any production of it. "Yes," she said simply. "That's exactly it." It was in those first weeks of shared labor and shared observation and shared evenings that Olive began to understand the difference between the marriage she had imagined and the marriage she was actually in. The imagined version had been a sensible arrangement, two compatible people building a practical life together. The actual version had something else running through it, something she recognized but had not planned on, a genuine pull toward this particular man, a specific and insistent desire to know him more thoroughly than she currently did. She noticed the way he moved through work, with an economy of motion that spoke of long practice and genuine skill. She noticed that he read in the evenings with a focused intensity that reminded her of herself, and that he would occasionally look up from a book to say something about what he was reading with the particular expression of a person whose mind is actively engaged with an idea. She noticed that he was unfailingly patient with the animals in a way that was not performance, that it was simply how he was. She noticed that he laughed infrequently, but when he did it was unguarded and complete. She was falling in love with him in the careful, accumulative way that feels more permanent than the lightning strike variety, and she was aware of it happening, which was both unusual and entirely appropriate for a woman who organized typed drawers and wrote midnight letters. Paul Atkins was not a man accustomed to examining his own interior landscape with much directness. He had spent 6 years building a practical life in a practical place, and had found that the approach served him well. But Olive Maddox, now Olive Atkins, was producing in him a series of reactions that he found himself entirely unable to categorize as practical. It was the way she engaged with everything. She did not approach the ranch with the wariness of a person tolerating a difficult situation. She approached it with an active, specific, unself-conscious curiosity that reminded him, every day, of the letter about the typed drawer, the image of a woman spending an entire Sunday reorganizing something simply because she saw how it could work better. She did the same with the kitchen garden, rearranging the planting logic after a week of observation in a way that he could see was smarter than what had been there before. She did the same with his bookshelves, proposing a reorganization by subject, an author that he agreed to partly because the argument she made for it was genuinely sound, and partly because watching her lay out the argument was the most enjoyable thing that had happened to him in months. He found himself looking for excuses to be in whatever room she was in. He found himself looking forward to the evenings, in a way he had not looked forward to evenings since he could not remember when. He found himself, on a warm evening in May, sitting on the porch beside her after supper, watching the last light leave the mountains, and feeling with absolute clarity that this woman was the most interesting person he had encountered in his 30 years on Earth, and that the thought of her ever going back to Cincinnati or anywhere else was something he could not entertain without a physical sensation of wrongness. He was not entirely sure how to say any of this. He was Paul Atkins. He wrote clean letters and built solid fences and doctored sick cattle, and was not especially practiced in the language of what he was currently feeling. On a Saturday afternoon in May, the thing that changed the nature between them happened without much preamble, as the important things generally do. They had ridden out together to check the east fence line, a stretch that had been giving trouble since a late spring storm had brought a large branch down across two of the posts. Olive had been riding for 3 weeks by then, having approached the skill with the same determined practical intelligence she brought to everything. And while she was not yet graceful on horseback, she was competent and getting more so daily. They worked the fence together for 2 hours, Paul resetting posts while Olive held wire and handed tools with the easy efficiency of someone who understood the work's logic even when the specific mechanics were new. On the ride back, the sky turned dramatically. Colorado April weather, even in late May, retained the right to remind a person who was actually in charge, and the clouds that had been building in the northwest all afternoon made their intentions known with sudden conviction. The temperature dropped 15 degrees in 20 minutes and the rain came in hard and sideways. They pushed the horses to a run, but were still soaked through before they reached the barn. They got the horses under cover and stood in the barn doorway watching the rain come down in silver curtains across the yard, and Olive was laughing, the genuine unguarded laugh of a person who finds themselves thoroughly drenched in defiance of all reasonable expectation. Paul turned to look at her, and the thing he was feeling was so uncomplicated and so large that he did not have a way to manage it into something smaller and more practical. "Olive," he said. She turned, still laughing, water running off the brim of her hat, and she saw his face and the laughter settled into something else, something present and attentive and equally uncomplicated. He closed the distance between them. He was not a man who did things casually, and he did not kiss her casually. He kissed her with the same directness and complete intention he brought to everything important, one hand on the side of her wet face, and Olive Atkins, who had organized typed drawers and written midnight letters and ridden fences in the rain, kissed him back with the same complete intention, and felt the last possible reservation she had been keeping, without being fully aware of it, dissolve entirely. When they separated, the rain was still coming hard and the barn smelled of wet hay and horses and the good particular smell of soaked wool and cold air. "I should have said something sooner," he said. "You said things in letters," she replied. "You have been saying things in letters since January." "I did not say that specifically," he said. "No," she agreed, "but it was there, I read it." He looked at her with an expression she now knew how to name. "I am not a demonstrative man," he said. "I want you to understand that I am aware of that." "Paul," she said, "I wrote you a letter at midnight because I had run out of sensible alternatives. I think we can agree that we are both working with what we have." He made that sound she was learning to love, the low, quiet sound that was his version of genuine amusement, and pulled her back in by the wet sleeve of her coat, and held her against him in the barn doorway while the Colorado rain completed its demonstration of authority. Summer came to the ranch in a way that Olive would remember for the rest of her life as the most physically vivid season she had ever lived through. The heat was different from Ohio heat, dry and direct. the sunlight at this altitude coming down with a clarity that made everything look more itself than it had any right to. The land turned green in the creek bottoms and golden everywhere else, and the cattle moved across it in long drifts that she could watch from the porch in the early mornings with a mug of coffee, and a sense of rightness that she had never expected to feel so completely. She and Paul were building a life, and the building was not metaphorical. It was literal and daily and full of the specific gravity of real things. A kitchen garden that was producing beyond her first season hopes. A set of accounts that she had taken over from Paul and reorganized with the same instinct that had served the type drawer, finding efficiencies in supply ordering and record-keeping that saved them real money. The relationship between them, which was deepening in the way that only shared daily work and shared daily presence can deepen a relationship, laying down layer after layer of genuine knowledge. She learned that Paul's stillness was not vacancy, but was a quality of attention, that when he was quiet beside her he was fully present, and that this form of company was something she had been without for years without knowing it. She learned that his humor, which appeared rarely and without announcement, was worth waiting for. She learned that he was a man of absolute reliability, that if he said he would do something he did it, that his word was not a gesture but a fact, and that this quality, which she had come to take somewhat for granted in his letters, was in daily life something genuinely remarkable. He learned her in return. He learned that her competence was not self-containment, that she needed to speak her thoughts aloud in order to think them through, and that she valued engagement rather than simple agreement. He learned that she had a temper that showed itself rarely but completely, that when something struck her as genuinely unjust she went straight at it without ornamentation, which he respected even when it was directed at him. He learned that she had a physical bravery that came from competence rather than recklessness, that she did hard things simply because the things needed doing, without drama, but also without false stoicism. In July, a situation arose in Harlan Creek that tested Olive's temper in exactly the manner Paul had come to expect. A family named Reyes had settled on a homestead claim 2 miles north of town the previous year. The father, Eduardo Reyes, was a Mexican-born man who had come up from New Mexico territory with his wife and 2 sons. He had filed a legitimate claim, built a solid house, and fenced his quarter section appropriately. He was, by every legal and practical measure, a settler with full rights to his land. In July, a group of 3 men from a larger cattle operation further east decided that they wanted the Reyes land for additional grazing rights, and expressed this desire through a series of escalating pressures that stopped short of outright violence, but were clearly intended to make the Reyes family feel that staying was more trouble than leaving. Olive heard about this from Martha Driscoll on a Thursday morning at the general store. Martha relayed it with the compressed anger of a woman who has seen injustice before and is tired of it, and Olive walked out of the general store with a set to her jaw that Paul recognized when she came home that afternoon and understood immediately. "Tell me," he said. She told him. He listened without interrupting. "I know Eduardo Reyes," Paul said when she finished. "He is a good man and a careful homesteader. His claim is legitimate. I have seen the filing." "Then what are we going to do about it?" Olive said. Paul was quiet for a moment in the way that meant he was thinking rather than avoiding. "Tomorrow I am going to talk to Driscoll and to Holt," he said. "The men doing this are relying on Reyes having no one who will stand up alongside him. If enough of the established settlers make clear that the community will not accept this kind of pressure, the calculation changes. And if they do not listen to community disapproval," Olive pressed, "then Reyes has a legitimate claim on file with the Territory Land Office, and we will help him make use of it," Paul said. "These men are not operating within the law and they know it." Olive looked at her husband. "All right," she said, "that is the right approach." "You expected something less?" he asked. "I expected you would know what the right thing was," she said. "I just wanted to make sure we were going to do it." Paul did exactly what he said he would do. Within 2 days, he had spoken to enough of the established homesteaders and local businessmen around Harlan Creek that a clear message was delivered to the men from the Eastern Cattle Operation, not through confrontation, but through the simple massed weight of community position. The message was that Eduardo Reyes's claim was recognized as legitimate by the people of this community, that any attempt to take his land by intimidation would be met with legal and communal resistance, and that the men involved would find their own business interests in the territory significantly complicated if they persisted. The pressure on the Reyes family stopped. Eduardo Reyes came to the Atkins ranch on a Sunday afternoon to express his thanks. He was a compact, quiet man with careful eyes and a dignity that was entirely self-possessed. He thanked Paul plainly and then turned to Olive with an expression of genuine recognition. "I am told it was your wife who brought this to the community's attention," he said. "She brought it to mine," Paul said. "The rest followed from that." Reyes looked at Olive with a small, formal nod that contained more than the gesture itself. "Thank you, Mrs. Atkins," he said. "Your claim is legitimate and your family belongs here," Olive said simply. "There is nothing to thank me for." That evening, after the Reyes had left and the supper dishes were washed and the evening had settled into its quiet, Paul looked at his wife across the kitchen table with an expression that she had learned over these months to recognize as the one that meant he was about to say something that mattered to him. "You are a remarkable person," he said. She looked up from the mending she was doing. "I merely did what was obvious," she said. "Obvious things are often left undone," he said. "You don't leave them undone." She set the mending down. "Paul," she said, "I came to Colorado because I was tired of being sensible. And then I found that being genuinely good is the most interesting thing available to a person. You already knew that. I am still learning it." He reached across the table and took her hand, and they sat like that in the lamplight for a while without needing to say anything further. By August, the mountains to the west were pulling long afternoon shadows across the valley, and Olive had been in Colorado for 4 months. She could ride properly now, sitting a horse with a confidence that had come from daily practice and the particular patience of a man who taught without condescension. She had midwifed 2 calves entirely on her own, managed a fence repair solo when Paul was down with a 2-day fever, and had begun helping the Reyes family's oldest son, a boy of 14 named Mateo, with reading and arithmetic on Tuesday afternoons at the kitchen table, because the school in Harlan Creek met only 3 days a week, and the teacher had acknowledged quite openly that her time and energy were spread too thin. Paul observed this Tuesday afternoon arrangement for 2 weeks without comment, then said one evening, "You know you are essentially running a school." "I am helping one child catch up," Olive said. "Mateo has brought 2 friends from town the last 2 Tuesdays," Paul said. Olive paused. "Has he?" "He has. I believe the friend total is now 4. She thought about it. "The teacher is overwhelmed," she said, "and these children are not getting what they need." "I know," Paul said. "I was thinking we might speak to Reverend Cole about making it official, using the church on Tuesday and Thursday afternoons. You have the skill and you clearly have the inclination." She looked at him. "You would not mind the time away from the ranch work." "Olive," he said, in the gentle, direct tone she had come to associate with statements he considered self-evident, "you have organized the accounts, replanted the garden, assisted with the calving-ridden fence line, and helped keep a neighbor family on their legitimate land. I think I can manage without you 2 afternoons a week." She laughed. "When you list it that way, I sound alarmingly industrious." "You are alarmingly industrious," he said. "It is one of your finest qualities." The arrangement with Reverend Cole was made within the week, and Olive Atkins began teaching 6 children, then 8, then 12, in the Harlan Creek Church on Tuesday and Thursday afternoons. She organized it with the same efficiency she brought to everything, assessing each child's level individually, setting realistic goals, drawing on the recollection of every book she had ever set type for in her father's printing shop to construct lessons that were both rigorous and interesting. She wrote to her father for materials, simple primers, arithmetic texts, paper, pencils. George Maddox sent them with a letter that said, among other things, that he believed she had found the right country. The school, informal as it was, became something important in Harlan Creek in a way that Olive had not planned, and Paul observed with a quiet pride that he expressed in the way he expressed most things of importance, with brief, precise statements that she had learned to receive as the full and genuine things they were. "Every person in town speaks about what you are doing with the children," he told her one evening. "Every single one. They are good children," she said. "They deserve proper attention." "They are getting it," he said, "because of you." In September, Olive realized she was expecting their first child. She told Paul on a Thursday morning when the light was coming through the kitchen window at that particular September angle that made everything look more permanent than usual. She told him plainly, as she told him most things, watching his face for the reaction. What happened to Paul Atkins's face in the moment she told him was something she had not seen before and would think about for years afterward. It was not the managed, careful expression he brought to difficult situations, and it was not the quiet warmth she had come to know as his daily register. It was something more entirely unguarded than either, a kind of open astonishment and joy that had not had time to be arranged into anything more composed. He crossed the kitchen in 3 steps and held her with a completeness that said everything the words he was searching for had not yet managed to say. "Are you well?" he asked, against her hair. "I am entirely well," she said. "Somewhat tired in the mornings, otherwise completely well." "I will reduce the fence work," he said immediately. "Paul," she said, pulling back enough to look at him, "I carried a calf to the barn last Tuesday. I think I can manage my current level of activity." "You carried a calf to the barn last Tuesday," he repeated. "It was confused and the fence was open and someone had to do it," she said. He looked at her with the expression that was his particular form of profound, helpless amusement. "I married a woman who carries calves," he said. "You married a woman who told you she was stubborn," she replied. "You were warned." He laughed, the full, unguarded laugh she loved, and pulled her back in, and she stood in the kitchen of the solid 3-room house in the Colorado Territory and felt the particular happiness of a life that has become, in some essential and irreversible way, exactly right. They wrote to Olive's father together that evening, Paul adding a paragraph to the end of her letter in his clean, precise handwriting that said, "Mr. Maddox, your daughter is the most capable person I have encountered in 30 years of observing people carefully. I want you to know that she has made this place something it was not before she came, and that I am aware of this every day." George Maddox wrote back within the week. He would come to Colorado in the spring, he said. He had been thinking about it anyway. A man could not run a printing shop alone indefinitely, and a man's daughter was a more pressing consideration than a printing shop in any case. Olive read this letter at the kitchen table and had to excuse herself briefly, because she was not a woman who cried easily or often, and she intended to maintain that reputation at least partially. The winter of 1883 settled over the Colorado Territory with a seriousness that Paul had warned her about, and that still exceeded her preparation for it, not because of its physical difficulty, which was considerable, but because of the particular quality of light and time it produced. The days were short and steel gray. The nights were genuinely cold. The landscape outside the windows was bleached and still, and Olive, 4 months into her pregnancy, and therefore required to reduce several of the more strenuous activities she had been filling her days with, found herself with more thinking time than was always comfortable. She thought about Cincinnati, about her father's printing shop, about the schoolroom table where she and Ruth and Clara had laughed at the advertisement in the newspaper. She thought about the midnight desk and the letter she had written to a stranger in Colorado, and the particular combination of audacity and exhaustion and genuine longing that had produced it. She thought about how close she had come to not mailing it, about how many sensible reasons there had been to put it aside and remain in the life she already had. She thought about how different that life would have been, and felt in the contrast a quality of gratitude so large it was almost uncomfortable. Paul found her one evening in early December sitting in the chair by the bookshelf with one of his books open on her lap but not being read, looking at the fireplace with the particular interior expression that he had learned meant she was not just thinking but processing something deep. He sat on the edge of the hearth and waited. "I was thinking about the advertisement," she said eventually. "Were you?" he said. "And the letter I wrote at midnight," she said. "I was laughing at the whole thing, you know. I genuinely found it funny. You told me that in the letter itself," he said. "And then I wrote it anyway," she said. "The most honest letter I had written in years, and I wrote it because I was laughing." He was quiet for a moment. "I think honesty sometimes requires a certain lightness," he said. "When you are not protecting yourself, when you think it does not matter." She looked at him. "It did matter," she said. "Yes," he said. "It mattered a great deal." She closed the book on her lap and held it in both hands. "I am glad I wrote it," she said. "I am glad the midnight and the candle and the print shop smell and the foolishness all came together in exactly that particular order. I am glad of all of it." "So am I," he said simply. "Every day." He moved from the hearth to the chair beside hers and took the book from her hands and set it aside and held her hand instead. And they sat together in front of the fire, while the Colorado winter moved around the solid walls of the house he had built with his own hands. And Olive thought that this was the story she had not known she was writing at that midnight desk, letter by letter, line by line, in the honest language of a person who had run out of sensible alternatives and found, in the running out, something entirely real. The winter passed as serious winters do, day by hard day, with the work of keeping the animals alive and the house warm, and the supplies stretched adequately, providing a structure that Olive found, somewhat to her surprise, entirely sustaining. There was something about the clarity of winter survival, the reduction to what was actually necessary, that she found deeply satisfying in a way that the comfortable complexity of Cincinnati life had never produced. She continued teaching on the days when the weather permitted travel into town, wrapping herself in layers against the cold, and driving the wagon with an ease that would have been unrecognizable to the woman who had arrived from Cincinnati 8 months before. The children came regardless of weather because their parents sent them, recognizing in what Olive had built something genuinely valuable, and there were now 14 regular students ranging in age from 6 to 15. Reverend Cole, who observed all of this with evangelical satisfaction, began advocating to the town for a proper school building. He brought it to the twice-yearly town meeting in January with a proposal so thorough and so obviously the product of Olive's organizational intelligence that several people in the meeting looked directly at her before looking at the Reverend. The school building was approved in January, and construction was planned for spring. Paul donated timber from the stand of cottonwoods along his East Creek boundary, and 3 other homestead families donated labor, and it was understood by everyone in Harlan Creek, though not formally stated anywhere, that Olive Atkins would be the school's teacher, and that this was a fine outcome for everyone involved. George Maddox arrived in Harlan Creek in April of 1884, a Tuesday, on the same stage line his daughter had ridden 11 months before, carrying 2 large trunks and a box of books, and the particular look of a man who has made a decision he is not entirely certain about but is committed to entirely. Olive met him at the stage stop in Millhaven with the wagon, alone, because Paul was needed at the ranch for a calving situation. She was visibly pregnant now, 7 months along, and her father looked at her for a long moment when she stepped down from the wagon to embrace him, taking in her tanned face and capable hands and the particular quality of ease in her movement, the ease of a person who belongs in the place they are. "You look well," he said. "You look more yourself than I have seen you look since your mother was alive." "This is the right place, Father," she said. "Come and see it." He saw it. He saw the ranch and the house and the bookshelves and the school building going up in town, and the community of people who had been shaped by the same hard country into something genuine and direct. He met Paul, and the 2 men regarded each other with the careful mutual assessment of people who have something important in common, and are each determining whether the other understands that. By the end of the first day, George Maddox and Paul Atkins were talking at the kitchen table about the printing trade and the territory's growing need for local printing services, because there was no printer within 60 miles of Harlan Creek, and the demand for printing, from legal documents to business notices to the kind of small newspapers that frontier communities produced to maintain their sense of their own existence, was going unmet. "A small press," George said. "Nothing elaborate. A hand press with a reasonable type supply. It would pay in a town like this." "A town like this is growing," Paul said. "The county seat is 40 miles east and the roads are not reliable in winter. Local printing would be used." George looked at his son-in-law with the assessing look of a printer calculating costs. "I brought some type," he said. Paul looked back at him. "I noticed the box," he said. They both looked at Olive. She was sitting across the table with her coffee, and the expression of a woman who has watched something she hoped would happen exactly as hoped. "I told him the type drawer story," she said to Paul. "Naturally," he said, and that warmth came into his face that she had been collecting for a year now, each instance of it more familiar and more precious than the last. Her son was born on the 23rd of May, 1884. The birth was attended by Martha Driscoll, who had attended enough frontier births to function with a calm competence that Olive found genuinely steadying when theory gave way to the unmediated reality of the thing. Paul sat outside the bedroom door throughout, and Olive could hear him moving, occasionally, back and forth across the floor in a way that was entirely unlike his usual stillness, and told her more about what he was feeling than any amount of words. The baby was healthy and loud about his opinions from the first moment, which Martha said was a very good sign. Paul came in when Martha opened the door. He stood in the doorway and looked at Olive in the bed holding the infant, and what happened to his face was the second time she had seen him completely unmanaged, and it was as remarkable as the first. He sat on the edge of the bed and she put the baby into his hands, and he held his son with the same careful completeness he brought to everything that mattered, and looked down at him with an expression of such entirety that Olive felt her heart full to the exact edge of what it could contain. "What should we call him?" she asked. Paul looked up from the baby. "You've had thoughts," he said. "It was not a question." "George," she said, "if you agree." He looked at his son and then looked at the doorway beyond which her father was being kept at barely manageable distance by the requirement to wait. "George," he said, "yes." When George Maddox was permitted into the room and told that his grandson carried his name, the old printer sat down in the chair beside the bed and held both of Olive's hands for a moment without speaking, and then said, very quietly, "Your mother would be so proud of you." Olive held that for a long time. Young George, as he immediately became in distinction from his grandfather, was a sturdy, curious baby who arrived in the world with what Olive recognized as her own quality of active engagement, the constant turning of attention toward whatever was new and interesting. He did not sleep much, which she accepted with the practicality of a woman who had organized type drawers and calved cows in the rain, reasoning that a child with opinions was probably a good thing in the long run, even when the short run was exhausting. Paul held his son with a consistency and completeness that she found beautiful to watch. The same man who had once described himself as not demonstrative, now thoroughly given over to this particular form of tenderness that he had apparently been saving without knowing it. He talked to the baby with the same quiet directness he brought to everything, explaining what he was doing and why, which Olive privately believed was excellent developmental practice, and also charming beyond her ability to remain unmoved by it. Old George, as he was already becoming, set up a small printing operation in the space behind the general store that Holt leased to him at a fair rate, and within 3 months was producing legal documents, business circulars, and the first edition of a 4-page weekly newspaper that he called the Harlan Creek Register. It was not a sophisticated publication by the standards of city newspapers, but it was precise and honest and engaged with the community's actual concerns, and it was read by every literate person in town and surrounding homesteads with the hunger of people who had been doing without. Olive wrote a regular column for the Register which she called Practical Matters, and which addressed in her direct and unornamental prose things like soil preparation, livestock management, seasonal supply planning, and once memorably the legal rights of homestead settlers, which was read aloud at the next town meeting and passed hand to hand for weeks afterward. Paul read every issue of the Register at the kitchen table on Friday evenings, with the focused attention he brought to all printed material, and occasionally looked up to tell his wife that a particular paragraph was exactly right, which she received as the highest form of praise he offered, and which she had learned was entirely genuine. The school building was completed in June, and Olive was confirmed as the school's teacher at the July town meeting, with a modest salary that the community voted to fund through a small assessment on the commercial properties in town. She would continue through the end of the school year, taking a teacher's assistant, a sharp girl of 15 named Anna Booth, whose family had arrived from Kansas in the spring, and who had an aptitude for organization that Olive recognized and immediately cultivated. She was aware, in a general way, that she was building something in Harlan Creek beyond her own household, and she found this deeply satisfying without taking it too seriously, because the building was a natural consequence of the people around her and the needs they had, and she was simply applying to those needs the same qualities she had applied to the type drawer, the calving barn, the accounts, the ranch fences. The instinct to see how things could work better and then make them do so. Summer and then fall moved across the Colorado Territory in the way that Olive had now lived through twice, and the second time was different from the first in the way that known things are different from unknown ones, richer with recognition, colored by the knowledge of what came before and what would come next. She knew the smell of the cottonwood trees in September and the quality of light in October, and the way the first snow sat on the mountains before it came down to the valley. She knew this land now. She belonged to it in the way that you can only belong to a place after you have worked in it through all its seasons, which is not the belonging of birth but the belonging of choice, which is in some ways deeper. She and Paul had settled into a life together that had the ease and the depth of things built over time, the ease being a product of the depth rather than a replacement for it. They were still learning each other in the ways that two people who are paying genuine attention to each other continue to learn new things indefinitely. But the learning now had the pleasure of building on a substantial foundation rather than starting from the beginning. He still brought her coffee when she was working late at her desk on lesson plans or register columns, setting it down without interrupting, present and attentive, and giving her the space to be fully herself while also being fully beside her. She still told him her thoughts aloud in order to think them through, and he still engaged with them with the active intelligence she had first glimpsed in his letters, the intelligence that had convinced her, at midnight in Cincinnati, that this was a man worth writing to. They still read in the evenings, often in the same room with different books, the fire going, young George in his cot, old George's printing press 2 miles away turning the week's events into something the community could hold in its hands. On those evenings the silence was the silence Paul had mentioned in the advertisement, the long silences of frontier life. But it was inhabited silence, shared and warm, and Olive thought of that line often and felt each time that she had understood it even before she had known it. In the spring of 1885 she found herself, on a May morning in the kitchen with the light coming through the window at that particular angle, certain that she was expecting again. She told Paul over coffee directly as she told him most things. His face did the thing it did, the brief and total openness, and then he smiled at her, and the smile was the full version that she had been collecting for 2 years, the version that was entirely his and was directed entirely at her. "How are you feeling?" He asked. "Well," she said, "completely well." "You will tell me if that changes," he said. "You will know immediately," she said. "You always do." He reached across the table in the same gesture she remembered from that November evening by the fire, taking her hand across the small kitchen table. And they sat together, while the Colorado morning came in through the windows, and young George, 1 year old now and of profoundly determined mobility, navigated the kitchen floor on his way toward something that interested him. Their daughter arrived in December of 1885, during the first real snowstorm of the season, in a berth that was managed with the same capable attentiveness Martha Driscoll brought to everything. Paul was in the barn when the storm began and made it back to the house through 6 inches of new snow to sit outside the bedroom door in precisely the same pattern of occasional movement he had exhibited 19 months before. They named the girl Ada, after Paul's mother, who had died when he was 12, and whom he had spoken of to Olive in a winter letter, briefly, and with the particular economy he used for things that were deeply felt. Ada was different from her brother in every way that mattered and similar to him in every way that mattered more. She slept well and ate well, and regarded the world from her first days with an expression of such composed assessment that Martha Driscoll said she was an old soul, which Olive felt was accurate. Paul held Ada with the same completeness he brought to young George, but there was something particular in the way he looked at his daughter, something that Olive saw and knew she would spend years watching and be glad of. It was the way a person looks at something that has arrived in their life like a correction they did not know they needed. Old George held his granddaughter in the printing shop on the day Olive first brought her to town, and told Ada, who was 11 days old, and listening with the composed attention she had been exhibiting since birth, that she had excellent timing, arriving in winter when the news was slow and her grandfather had time to think. That year, 1886, was the year the school in Harlan Creek grew to 32 students, and the question of Olive's continued management of it became something more formal than a town meeting vote. The County Education Board, which had been watching what was happening in Harlan Creek from its seat 40 miles east, sent a representative in March to assess the school formally. The representative was a serious woman named Mrs. Helena Pratt, who had been running county schools for 15 years and had learned to recognize real teaching when she saw it. She sat in the back of the schoolroom for an entire Tuesday and watched Olive teach 12 children simultaneously at 3 different levels, with an economy and a warmth that produced visible engagement from every child in the room. She watched Olive manage a conflict between 2 older students with a directness and fairness that resolved it permanently within 10 minutes. She watched Anna Booth, now 16 and operating as a genuine teaching assistant, manage the younger children with a competence that was entirely a product of Olive's training. After school, Mrs. Pratt sat with Olive at the kitchen table and asked questions for an hour. She then wrote a letter to the County Education Board that was, by the standards of County Education Board correspondence, notably enthusiastic, and which resulted in a formal teaching certificate and a proper county salary for Olive Atkins, formally recognizing what Harlan Creek already knew. Paul heard this news at the kitchen table and looked at his wife with the quiet pride that was one of his most consistent gifts to her. "A formal certificate," he said. "Which I should have obtained through conventional means years ago," she said. "But the county has apparently decided that 4 years of practical results constitute an adequate substitute for formal training." "You organized 14 children from 3 ability levels simultaneously," he said. "I believe that exceeds what formal training provides." "You are somewhat biased," she said. "I am entirely biased," he said. "I am also entirely correct." She laughed, and he reached for her hand, and young George, now 2.5, looked up from the floor where he was engaged with a collection of wooden blocks and said, with the clarity of a child who has been raised among precise language, "What is funny, Mama?" "Your father," she said, "is being both biased and correct at the same time. George considered this seriously. "That sounds good," he said. "It is," she agreed. The years settled in around the Atkins ranch and family and town, with the particular quality of time that comes when a life is genuinely occupied. Full days and rich seasons, and the slow accumulation of things built and tended and grown. Paul's herd grew to 200 head, and the ranch expanded by another quarter section purchased from a homesteader who was moving further west, because the territory was that way, always moving, new people arriving and some people moving on, the country always being reinvented. Harlan Creek itself grew. A new doctor arrived in 1886, a young man named Dr. Emmett Walsh who had trained in St. Louis and come west for reasons he kept somewhat private, but which seemed to involve both a genuine vocation and a slightly complicated relationship with city life. He set up a small practice in a building next to the general store and immediately became an essential part of the community in the way that doctors in frontier communities always did, because the distance to the nearest hospital was 40 miles and the country between was not forgiving. Olive befriended Dr. Walsh quickly, because she had a habit of befriending people who were genuinely competent and genuinely curious, and he was both. She brought him into the school on a monthly basis to speak to the children about health and hygiene, which was, she argued, a practical curriculum matter, and which the children found interesting in the particular way children find interesting any adult who talks to them honestly about how the body works. Dr. Walsh became, over that first year, a regular presence at the Atkins kitchen table on Sunday evenings, joining Paul and old George for supper and the conversation that had become a feature of those evenings. Talk about what was happening in the territory and in the broader country, about the railway lines pushing further west and what they would do to the cattle trade, about the politics of the territory's eventual application for statehood, about the books that came through old George's printing shop in exchange for printing work. Olive sat at those Sunday tables and thought, regularly, about the schoolroom table in Cincinnati, where Ruth had passed the newspaper clipping around, about the laughter and the dismissal and the secret midnight letter. She thought about how a single honest moment at a desk, fueled by exhaustion and amusement and some unnamed and restless longing, had produced this, all of this, the solid house and the growing school and the town that had become her town, and the man across the table who was Paul Atkins, 33 years old now, and still reading everything he could find and still bringing coffee at late hours, and still making that low, quiet sound that was his version of genuine amusement, and still. After 3 years of daily life and 2 children and 100 hard seasons and 10,000 shared hours, still the most genuinely interesting person she had ever known. She thought she would tell him that. She thought it often and occasionally said it, and when she did his face did the thing it did, the brief total openness, and she collected that too each time, adding it to what she was building. In the winter of 1887, a letter arrived from Cincinnati. It was from Ruth, her friend from the schoolroom, the one who had passed the newspaper clipping around. Ruth was married now to a lawyer in Cincinnati, and wrote with the comfortable certainty of a woman settled in her expected life, which was, Olive gathered, both genuinely pleasant and occasionally slightly small. Ruth wrote that Clara had also married, a banker's son, and that the schoolroom circle had dispersed into its expected shapes. She wrote that she thought often of Olive's dramatic departure for Colorado and wondered how it had turned out. She wrote that she supposed it was quite rough out there and asked if Olive missed the city. Olive sat with the letter for a while, looking at it, feeling the distance between Ruth Cincinnati and her own Harlan Creek as both a geographical and a phenomenological fact. Then she wrote back. She wrote back 10 pages. She told Ruth about the ranch and the cattle and the school and the 32 students and the formal teaching certificate. She told her about the Ray's family and the community's response to injustice and what that had felt like. She told her about the midnight letter and what had produced it and what it had produced. She told her about Paul, specifically and precisely, the way he held his children and the way he read in the evenings and the way he had said, on an April afternoon in front of a fireplace, that he had thought it was going to work since the letter about the type drawer. She wrote, "I was laughing when I wrote that midnight letter, Ruth. I was laughing at the whole thing, at the bluntness and the frontier practicality and the complete absence of romantic pretense. And then I wrote the most honest letter I had written in years and mailed it, and it brought me here. I am not sure what that means about the relationship between honesty and laughing, but I think they are more connected than we generally acknowledge." She also wrote, "He told me that beauty was unnecessary in the advertisement, which was true. What was necessary and what I seemed to have supplied to a workable degree was the stubborn part. He was right about that too. We were both, I think, more accurately described by that advertisement than either of us was prepared to admit." She sealed the letter and sent it and did not hear back from Ruth for 6 weeks, and when she did, Ruth's reply was shorter than usual but had a different quality to it, more careful, more genuinely curious. She asked 3 specific questions about the school and 2 about the territory and 1, at the end, about what it was actually like to have made a choice that no one expected. Olive answered all of them honestly. By 1888, young George was 4 years old and had developed a passion for horses that was beginning to approach the intensity of genuine vocation, following his father around the barn with a focus and a patience that Paul observed with visible, quiet pleasure. Ada was 2 and had begun to speak in complete sentences at an age that Dr. Walsh said was entirely unusual, and that Anna Booth, who sometimes assisted at the school and occasionally watched the children, said was merely the logical result of growing up in a house where all the adults used language with precision. The school had expanded again, requiring a second room added to the building, which the community funded through a combination of a county grant that Olive had written the application for, a donation from the Reyes family in recognition of what the school had meant for Mateo, who was now 18 and studying for a position with the Territorial Surveyor's Office, and a contribution from old George's printing business, which had become genuinely profitable as the town grew. Olive taught mornings, and Anna Booth, now 19 and a genuine teacher in her own right, taught afternoons. They had divided the curriculum by subject, with Olive taking reading and writing and history, and Anna taking arithmetic and the rudiments of science and geography. It was a functional arrangement that worked because both women were genuinely invested in it, and neither had any interest in the kind of territorial competition that made such arrangements fail elsewhere. Old George Maddox, at 62, had put down roots in Harlan Creek in the way that surprised him when he thought about it directly. He had not intended to stay permanently when he arrived in the spring of 1884. He had intended to see his daughter settled and perhaps spend a season. He had stayed because the printing shop gave him purpose, and the grandchildren gave him joy, and the community gave him the particular sense of being necessary that a man of his nature required to feel genuinely alive. He had a room at the house of the Driscoll family, who had taken in boarders as their own children grew up and left for other towns, and he came to the Atkins ranch for Sunday suppers with the comfortable regularity of a man entirely at home. Paul and his father-in-law had developed a relationship that Olive watched with deep satisfaction, 2 precise and capable men who had found in each other a form of recognition, the recognition of people who build things carefully and take pride in what they build. They talked about everything, Paul bringing the land knowledge and the cattle knowledge and the territory's physical realities, George bringing the printed world and the larger news and the long history of things. And between the 2 of them, they produced a conversation that was, Olive thought, the best regular conversation she had access to, which was saying something given that she also participated in it. On a Sunday evening in the spring of 1888, when the children were in bed and old George had gone back to town, and Dr. Walsh had said his good nights, Olive and Paul sat on the porch in the early dark of a Colorado spring night, the mountains still white with the last of the winter's snow, the valley below them showing the first green push of the new season. She was thinking, as she often did in these porch evenings, about nothing in particular and everything in general, the kind of thinking that the quiet large land produced in her, a sort of wide-ranging attention that was not quite thought and not quite feeling but something between the two. "What are you thinking?" Paul asked. She considered. "I was thinking about the fact that I organized a type drawer once and you read about it and decided I was probably the person you were looking for," she said, "and that this seemed at the time like a somewhat slender basis for a major life decision." "It was not a slender basis," he said. "It told me three things." She turned to look at him in the near dark. "What three things?" "That you see how things could work better," he said. "That when you see it, you do something about it, even on a Sunday afternoon when no one asked you to. And that you told me about it without making it a performance. Which meant you were someone who was honest about themselves without being self-aggrandizing." She was quiet for a moment. "You concluded all of that from a type drawer story." "I had already concluded some of it from the letter," he said. "The type drawer confirmed it." She looked at the mountains, their white peaks barely visible now in the fading light. "What about you?" she asked. "I mean, what did I conclude from your letters that told me you were the right one?" He was quiet, in the way that meant he was actually thinking about the question rather than formulating a polite response. "Tell me," she said. "The fact that you laughed at the advertisement and wrote the letter anyway," he said finally. "That told me you were someone who could see the humor in something and still take it seriously. I thought that was rare." She felt the warmth that moved through her at his particular form of directness, at the way he said the thing he meant without reducing it or inflating it. "It is rare," she agreed. "And the line about running out of sensible alternatives," he said. "I read that and understood it completely. I had placed the advertisement because I had run out of more elegant solutions. We were both just being honest about that." She laughed softly. "A romantic foundation," she said. "Most romantic one I know," he said seriously. "Two honest people running low on pretense." She leaned against him in the porch chair, and he put his arm around her with the ease of a man completely settled in the fact of her, and they sat together in the Colorado dark while the land around them breathed its wide, indifferent breath, which was not indifferent to them any more because they had made themselves part of it, season by season, day by day, in all the ways that a life made of real things is made. Young George called from inside the house with the authority of a 4-year-old who has decided that sleep is negotiable. Olive and Paul looked at each other. "Your turn," they said simultaneously. And then they both laughed, the easy full laughter of people entirely at home in the same moment, and Paul went inside, and Olive sat with the mountains for one more minute, full of the evening and the year and the years before it and the years to come, full of the particular contentment of a person who made a wild and midnight choice and has found on the far side of it exactly what they were hoping for, and several things they never thought to hope for at all. She sat with it and was glad, and then went inside to her children and her husband and her father and her life, which was solid and warm and built of honest things, and which was, in every measure that mattered, exactly right. In the autumn of 1889, Colorado was admitted as the 38th state of the Union, which produced a celebration in Harlan Creek that old George covered extensively in the Register, and which involved a dance in the church that lasted until 2 in the morning, and which Olive danced at with Paul and with young George, who was 5, and discovered that evening that he shared his mother's enjoyment of dancing and his father's sense of rhythm, which were complementary qualities that produced a very good small dancer. The statehood year also brought new settlers, which it was expected to do, the formal status of statehood being a form of reassurance to the cautious that the territory was now a permanent and settled enterprise rather than a frontier speculation. Several families arrived in the Harlan Creek area that fall and winter, and the school enrollment jumped to 44 students, requiring a genuine reconsideration of how the building was organized. Olive drafted a proposal for the county education board for a full expansion, 2 additional classrooms and a 3rd teacher, and submitted it with supporting data about enrollment trends and projected population growth and the educational outcomes of the current students, several of whom had gone on to secondary study in larger towns, which she documented carefully. The proposal was approved in January of 1890, and construction began in spring. Anna Booth, 23 now and fully established as a genuine educator, was confirmed as the 2nd permanent teacher. Olive interviewed 3 candidates for the 3rd position and hired a young man from Denver named Mr. Thomas Hale, who had formal training from the Territorial Normal School and who was, she determined after 2 interviews and a trial teaching session, genuinely skilled with the older students in a way that complemented what she and Anna offered. Paul observed this expansion with the same quiet satisfaction he observed all things his wife built, directly and without unnecessary commentary. "You are running a school of 3 teachers," he said one evening. "I am," she agreed. "And a county-certified curriculum," he said. "With the assistance of Mrs. Pratt, yes," she said. "From a newspaper advertisement," he said. She looked at him. He was looking at her with that expression, the one she had been collecting for 7 years. "Not from the advertisement," she said. "From a letter." "Written at midnight," he said. "Written at midnight," she agreed. "By a woman who was running out of sensible alternatives." He picked up her hand from the table between them and held it in the way he had been holding it for 7 years, entirely and without performance, the way he held everything that mattered to him. "I am grateful," he said simply, "for every sensible alternative you ran out of." She turned her hand over and held his in return, and outside the Colorado night was wide and full of stars, the same stars that had been above that flat Ohio city on the night she had sat at her desk with a candle and a pen and a clipping from a newspaper, the same stars that had been here when Paul had built this house with his own hands and placed the advertisement in the paper, and waited with the particular patience of a man who was not hoping for sentiment, but would have been glad of it. The stars did not know any of this being stars, but the people under them did. Young George, nearly 6, was asleep in his bed dreaming of horses. Ada, 3½, was asleep beside him in the manner of a child who has made a temporary tactical alliance with sleep. Old George, in his room at the Driscoll house in town, was probably still reading by candlelight, a habit he shared with his daughter that she thought was the deepest inheritance she carried. The school had 44 students and 3 teachers and a county budget, and a building with 2 added rooms. The Register printed weekly. The Reyes family remained on their land, Mateo now working officially with the Territorial Surveyor's office, and Eduardo Reyes was a member of the new town council. The ranch ran 200 head, and the east fence no longer gave trouble. Martha Driscoll came for coffee on the 2nd Friday of each month, and they spoke with the ease of 2 women who have known each other through enough seasons to have established something genuine and lasting. Dr. Walsh had married a widow from the next town over, a woman named Louise who had come to the territory from Pennsylvania, and had the practical, direct quality that the country produced in the people who stayed. They had a son of 2 years, and the Sunday suppers had expanded accordingly, Louise and Olive developing a friendship that had the particular character of friendships between competent women who recognize each other, which is immediate and unreserved, and based on the kind of mutual respect that has no time for the more decorative varieties of female sociability. Everything that had needed building had been built. Everything that had needed tending had been tended. Every person who had been in a difficulty had been helped. Every honest thing had been said, eventually, in the way that honest things get said, sometimes in letters and sometimes on porch steps and sometimes across kitchen tables in the early morning light. Olive Atkins, 30 years old in the state of Colorado in the year 1890, sat at the kitchen table on a morning in October with her coffee and the particular light, and thought about the woman who had sat in Cincinnati 7 years before with a newspaper clipping and a pen and a candle going low, and felt for her a gratitude so complete it was almost like love. That woman had been brave in the only way available to her at that moment, which was the midnight bravery of a person who picks up a pen when they have run out of excuses not to. She had written an honest letter to a stranger because she was tired of knowing exactly what she was doing, and what had come back from that honesty was a life so full and so real and so genuinely hers that she could not, on this October morning, imagine any arrangement of events in which she would have found it any other way. Paul came in from the barn with the cold morning air still on him and set his hat on the hook and poured his coffee and sat across from her in the way he had been sitting across from her for 7 years, entirely present, entirely himself. "Good morning," he said. "Good morning," she said. He looked at her with the expression she had been collecting, the warm, specific, unmanaged one. "The east pasture fence is holding," he said. "George wants to help with the horses this afternoon. Ada has apparently decided that she would prefer to come to school with you and has been lobbying her grandfather for support." Olive laughed. "Ada is 3 years old." "Ada is 3 years old and extremely persuasive," he said. "She gets that from her mother." "She gets everything from her mother," Olive said. "Yes," he said simply. "She does." He reached across the table in the gesture she knew completely, taking her hand. The Colorado morning came in through the kitchen window in the particular October light, clear and slant, and full of the season's last warmth, and the mountains to the west were showing the first dusting of new snow on their high peaks, and somewhere in the house young George was beginning to wake up with the purposeful energy of a child who has plans, and Ada was already awake because Ada was always already awake. It was a Tuesday. She had school in 2 hours. The horses needed water and the garden had the last of the winter squash still to bring in. There were letters to write, one to the County Education Board about the spring curriculum, and one to Ruth in Cincinnati, who wrote more regularly now and with more genuine curiosity. There was a column due to the Register by Thursday, and her father had mentioned wanting to talk about expanding the paper to 6 pages. There was everything. There was all of it. The whole full specific life of it, everything that had come from a midnight letter written in laughter, an honest longing by a woman who had run out of sensible alternatives. She held her husband's hand across the kitchen table in the morning light. It was, in every way she knew how to measure, exactly and completely enough.